So this video is going to go through day 3 of our Unit 3B notes on adding segments and angles. So let's say I know that AB is congruent to DE and BC is congruent to EF. Well, if I add AB plus BC and DE plus EF, doesn't it make sense that these whole segments would have to be congruent to each other? And ultimately, this looks like the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. This is what we're going to call our addition property. So equals plus equals create new equal segments. So in our first proof, I'm giving you that AB is congruent to CD. And I want to prove that AC is congruent to BD. In order to achieve this, I'm going to have to add BC to AB and CD to justify that each of those wholes would have to be equal to each other. So first step is always our given. Write that in our proof. And now I'm going to state that BC is congruent to itself by the reflexive property. Now I can state AB plus BC equals CD plus BC by adding these two sets of segments together. Now, looking at my diagram, what's another name for AB plus BC? Well, this part plus this part makes up the whole segment AC. CD plus BC gives me BD. So putting that together, that means that AC, the whole segment, must be congruent to BD, the whole segment. And that's our addition property. Now, just like how we can add segments together, we can also add angles. So coming on down to our next example, if I have that ABD is congruent to EFH and DBC is congruent to HFG, then it must be true that these two angles added together are congruent to these two added angles together. The whole is equal to the sum of its parts, so these two wholes would be equal if their parts are equal. So in our first proof, I'm giving you that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. I want to show that ABD, which is this whole angle, is congruent to DBC, which is that whole angle. So that means I'm just going to add 1 and 3 and 4 and 2 together. So this one's actually very quick. All right, write down our givens. Okay, now make sure you're adding the right ones together. I want 1 plus 3 is equal to 2 plus 4. So adding these equals together. Now another name for 1 plus 3 is this angle, ABD. And another name for 2 plus 4 is DBC. So angle DBC. That's what I was looking to prove. And that's addition. All right, so our first two proofs are really just the basics of how to add segments and angles. Now we're going to put them into some more complex proofs on the next page. All right, first thing I'm doing is giving you two congruent triangles, PTQ and STR. Now, there's no great way to really mark these, so I usually just like color them in. So actually, let me do this. I'll do pink. This guy, add a little color, and this guy, add a little color. And the great thing about being given congruent triangles is you know all their corresponding sides and angles are congruent, so that's helpful. I'm also telling you that M is the midpoint of QR, which is right along here. So that means QM must be congruent to MR. Now I'm looking to show that PM, which is this whole segment, is congruent to MS, which is this whole segment. So in the given, why do you think they gave me the congruent triangles? Well, that allows me to say that PQ is congruent to RS because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. If I know those two segments are congruent and QM is congruent to MR, that means I can add these two segments together to make the wholes equal. And that's the proof. All right, let's write it up. Okay, so first thing I need to talk about is that QM and MR are congruent. Because they didn't tell me that, I had to infer that from my given. All right, so I've talked about that. Now I have to talk about the congruent triangles, which allowed me to get PQ congruent to RS. All right, so now I've talked about those two things. Now that I have the two sets of equal things together, I now want to add them together. So make sure you're doing PQ plus QM. So these guys equals RS and MR. Now, this is where, again, if you accidentally switched up some of these segments, you'd catch yourself because what's another name for PQ plus QM? Go to your diagram. PQ, QM makes up PM. RS and MR together make our segment MS. All right, by adding their measures together, I can say now their whole segments are congruent, and that's just our addition. All right, next proof. I'm giving you angle 1 congruent to angle 3, and I want to show that AEC is congruent to DEB. Notice what those two overlapping triangles have in common. This angle 2. So I'm going to have to say that angle 2 is congruent to itself to be able to add to angles 1 and 3, which will allow me to say the whole angles are congruent. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Given. Angle 2, congruent to angle 2. Okay, now that I have the two things equal stated that I need to add, I'm going to add them together. So I have angle 1 plus angle 2 equals angle 3 plus angle 2. And what's another name for angle 1 plus angle 2? That makes up AEC. 3 plus 2 makes up DEB. So by adding their measures together, I was able to say part plus part equals whole, so my whole angles are congruent, and this is our addition. All right, last proof. AB is congruent to CD, and I'm looking to show that AC is congruent to BD. Notice that they're overlapping at BC, which I know is congruent to itself. So I'm going to do AB plus BC equals CD plus BC so that the two wholes are congruent. All right, so at step 2, I'm going to have to say BC is congruent to BC by a reflexive property. And now that I have the two sets of segments equal that I want to add, I'm going to carry out that addition. So now I'm going to say AB plus BC equals CD plus BC. But what's another name for AB plus BC? That makes up our whole segment AC, What's another name for CD plus BC? That makes up our whole segment, BD. Now that I've added, oops, did my notation wrong. Now that I've added my measures together, I can say that the whole segments are congruent. So therefore, at step 3, this is our addition property. All right, so those are the basics of adding segments and angles. In our next video, or our next lesson, we will talk about subtracting.